Okay, folks, make sure you get attendance in before we start. Okay, so everybody got that in? 4691? Okay, so first thing I want to talk about today is this article I found called The Boredom Economy. So what this article talks about is how the things people are buying has kind of changed with the pandemic. So demand for certain goods has changed quite a bit. Is there anything anybody can think of, anything they've experienced that they feel like they're buying more or seeing people buy more of? Yeah. What's that? Webcams? Okay, yeah, people are buying more webcams, right? That's one thing that people are buying more of because everybody's doing everything digitally. Anything else? Yeah. Masks, absolutely. So, a year ago, actually, this all started about a year ago, didn't it? So a year ago, you probably couldn't really imagine, the demand curve for masks being so far to the right, demand for masks being so high, right? Anything else? Yeah.
It sounds weird, but pets, I've never seen so many of my friends.
So that's kind of what this article is talking about. Is so like masks and webcams are more obvious ones. This article is actually talking about kind of the more, stuff that people are buying because they're bored. Yes.
Lumber has gone to the moon.
Yeah. The price of lumber.
Yes.
Interesting. Why is that?
It's because everybody started doing their home improvement stuff.
Okay.
I built a deck. My grandpa built a room on his house, and it's a 16 to 14 room, which should have a year ago that cost about $2,000 in lumber. It was about $4,000.
Wow.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So again, demand is rising for all these different things, and we would assume that the price is probably going up, right? So he mentioned that the price of lumber is going up because everybody's making these home improvements. And so, could anybody tell me, with the kind of graphing we're doing, can anybody tell me just the basic, what the graphing would look like for that? Like, how would we graph this increase in demand? We'd do one thing. What would we do if we wanted to draw it?
Shift the demand curve to the right.
Yeah, we shift the demand curve to the right, right? And what does that do? Shifting the demand curve to the right raises the price, right? We get a higher equilibrium price, okay? Any questions about that? Just a quick example, just talking about the kind of stuff that's changing.
I guess the masks, wouldn't the supply also move to the right?
So over time, yes. So that's actually something I'm going to mention in a bit, because right now what we're doing is we're talking about the immediate effects of things. So we keep everything else equal. So people have a higher preference for masks. It increases demand for masks. Obviously, in the long run, what have we seen? We've seen a bunch of companies repurpose to start supplying masks, but that's going to come later. So we're just talking about immediate effects right now. So the immediate effect is that the demand increases. Okay. If anybody, by the way, if anybody wants to spread out and like move into here, you're more than welcome. A lot of people, you could just change your seat on the seating chart if you really want to. If you want to spread out more, it's up to you. Well, anyway, yeah. So I want to go over a little bit of review, just because I saw some weird language used to describe certain things on PackBack, and I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So before we dig into equilibrium, we have to make sure we understand what terms mean, what things do, what they are. Okay, so first thing I want to go over is that quantity demanded is part of demand, but it's not the same thing as demand. So when the price for something goes down, the law of demand says the quantity demanded will increase. And if the price goes up, quantity demanded will go down. That's the law of demand. That's a movement along the demand curve. It's just a change in quantity caused by a change in price, right? But then external factors might change, and that's going to change the demand curve itself. So if someone's preference for something changes, if people have a higher preference for pets, now that we're in the middle of the pandemic and everybody's bored, people would be willing to pay a higher price at any given quantity of pets on the market, okay? Or at any given price, people would be willing to buy more pets, okay? So it changes. If demand changes, if demand itself changes, quantity demanded changes for all prices. I just want to show you that graphically real quick. We're going to switch. I'll come back to this so you can finish taking notes just real quick, just graphically again, right? If we were to move from D1 to D2 and we keep the price the same, the quantity demanded will just go up. So at any given price, the quantity demanded is going to change. We're moving the entire curve. That's a change in demand. Is that clear? Because the distinction between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded, it's an important distinction.
It's the line itself.
The line itself. We call it a curve. It's straight, but curve is just the term you're going to hear me use because that's mathematically what we refer to anything like this on a graph. But yes, the line itself.
Quantity demanded.
The quantity demanded is on that line. Exactly. And so once again, if demand changes, quantity demand changes for all prices. Any questions? Okay. So, same idea for supply, right? So the price of a good changes, quantity supply changes. And because of the law of supply, price and quantity for supply are positively correlated, right? So if the price goes up, quantity supplied increases because sellers are more incentivized to sell. Whereas the opposite is true for the law of demand, right? If the price goes up, you're less likely to buy it. So supply curves slope upward, demand curves slope downward. Any questions? I know we've done this before, but I just need to make sure it's solid in everybody's mind before we move forward. Okay. Again, external factors, think costs of production, technology. These are things that are going to move the whole supply curve. The easiest way you can think about this is just ask yourself, does this thing make it easier or harder to get this good onto the shelf? That's a shift in supply. So if there's a drought and you're a farmer, that makes it harder to get your goods on the shelf because it's harder to grow them in the first place. So that would shift supply itself. It would move the supply curve left. Remember, decreases move the curves left, increases move right. Any questions? Okay. Again, if supply changes, quantity supply changes for all prices. Okay, feel free to stop me at any time. Okay. Well, I see some people writing. And again, if you've been taking notes this whole time, the whole semester, you've probably written something along these lines down already. Okay. Again, as far as we're concerned, shifts in supply and demand are independent of each other. Okay, so you may think, well, if the demand for masks is increasing, eventually a bunch of companies are going to start building the infrastructure required to produce these masks. But we're looking at everything on its own, all else being equal. We call that ceteris paribus. So if I ask you, what's the immediate effect of the pandemic on the market for masks? It's to push demand, it's to increase demand. We're just looking at that thing on its own. But then if I said, what's the immediate effect of the government mandating that a bunch of companies switch their productive processes to start making protective equipment, then you could say, well, that would increase supply. So if the government starts subsidizing mass production, giving companies benefits for doing it, that increases supply. So in other words, we're not making any assumptions outside of what we're looking at on its own. So we just look at things in a vacuum. That may seem simplistic, but we're doing that because we're building up to more complex processes. Any questions about that? So the demand for bicycles has gone up during the pandemic because more people are, well, probably when the weather was nicer. But a student in my 830 class said that, he works at a bicycle shop and they're out of stock. Again, you may imagine, well, over time, some companies might start entering the bicycle business because it's so profitable right now. But on its own, we would just say that demand has increased for bicycles. So we look at things, we look at the immediate effect of the specific thing that we're talking about. So this actually comes up as a bonus question on the graphing assignment. So keep what I just said in mind, okay, when you're doing the graphing assignment. Again, this is kind of a lot of words to throw on the screen right now. Don't feel like you have to write this down. This is just what I'm saying. So, you may think, well, over time, if demand falls for something, maybe some companies are going to go out of business and supply is going to fall. But again, that's a long run effect that we're not worried about right now. We're just keeping things, the immediate effect. That's what we're looking at. Because we do everything ceteris paribus, all else equal. The long run stuff is going to come later. So any questions about that? This is all review. This is all stuff that you really need to have in mind when we get to equilibrium in a second. So any questions about anything I've mentioned so far? Yes, so external factors change supply and demand, which means they move the entire curve. Whereas a change in the price of the good just moves us along the curve, just changes the quantity. Okay. Yes.
I have a question about the supply curve.
Okay.
So if the quantity demanded, so the number manufactured becomes cheaper to manufacture, it'll shift to the right supply.
So any kind of increase in supply or demand is a rightward shift. So if it becomes cheaper to manufacture, it's going to shift the supply curve to the right. Now, the reason I don't say down and up is because down and up would be opposite for demand and supply curve. So increase in either is just right. It just goes right. And what do we see? That the equilibrium price falls. Any other questions? Okay, so that brings us to equilibrium. Now, remember, in economics, we're not here to make value judgments about whether a price for something is right or just or reasonable. That's all normative stuff. What stuff ought to be, what it should be, ethics, morality, that's all normative. We're doing positive analysis, which means we're just looking at how things are. So it may be a little bit shocking to you. Well, not shocking, maybe a little disturbing that, the John Lennon album that he signed for his killer right before he was murdered was expected. It went on auction. Ooh. Hold on. Oh, phone call from Arkansas. Should I pick up?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, wait. They hung up. I would have put it on speaker for you. It's probably them saying like they're from Hilton Hotels and I've won a weekend trip, or that my car insurance we've been trying to reach you. Yeah. Interesting stuff. So everybody's gotten this. Okay, so as I was saying, it may be a little bit disturbing to you that, this album that, he signed for The Man Who Murdered Him, is expected to draw 1 million. I don't know if it's been sold yet. A lot of these articles were from the end of last year. So I don't know if it's been on auction yet. But you can imagine why it would draw so much money. I mean, demand for something like that is probably pretty high. I mean, somebody out there, some collector, is willing to pay quite a bit of money for that. There's only one in existence, one of the most famous musicians of all time, murdered by a crazed fan. It's a shocking, morbid, but fascinating item. So it seems pretty intuitive why it would go for so much. Titanic. I would never pay that much, but some rich collector out there who has a very high income and really likes the movie Titanic or really likes Kate Winslet, is going to pay $330,000 for it. Leonardo da Vinci. Okay. I mean, probably the most famous artist of all time, sells for 450 million. It may seem absurd, but it makes sense. Somebody's willingness to pay for these things, these items that only one of them exists, someone's willingness to pay is very high. And the fact that only one of them exists means that the supply curve is very, very far to the left, which puts a lot of upward pressure on the price. So the more rare something is, the lower the supply is, the more expensive it's going to be. Okay. So that leads us to equilibrium. Has anybody seen this movie? It's not very good. Okay, so equilibrium, right? It's where the supply and demand curve intersect. It's where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So it's this scenario where the price is set in such a way where everyone who's willing and able to buy it and everyone who's willing and able to sell it are paired up perfectly. Now, again, that may seem a little unrealistic, but markets do tend toward that over time. In general, prices tend toward the spot where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are about equal. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? It's where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And now you said supply equals demand, and I know what you mean, and everybody else knows what you mean. But we got to be careful with the language we use, because if supply equaled demand, then these curves would just be on top of each other. Because supply is the entire curve, demand is the entire curve. So it's not where supply equals demand. We want to say it's where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So you may be given at some point, or maybe have to make one, a supply demand schedule. Notice that at $1, more is demanded than supplied. Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied at a price of $1. So what do you think is going to happen to the price? The price is probably going to go up. At a price of $2.20, quantity demanded is $4.20. Quantity supplied is $7.20. So there's excess supply of 300 units. The price is too high, and so the price should go down. What price do you think this market is going to tend toward? $1.40, because that's the equilibrium.
So why is that not, like, I feel like that sit more at 160, because that would be like the average between the two prices. That's not how that goes all the time.
Well, it's not about the average between those prices are arbitrary.
Okay.
The idea is that there's some price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied.
Yeah.
And so if we're at 160, the sellers are not selling all their stuff and they want to sell all their stuff. So they would have to lower the price to sell everything. Okay. I heard somebody chuckle when I said 420. Is there something funny about that number? Why is that funny?
It's associated with marijuana.
What's that?
It's a recreational drug.
No, I actually, never mind. We'll come back to that later. I'm just messing with you guys. I'm just trying to wake you guys up. I know I had this econometrics professor. Last year in my econometrics class, he would always like use the number 420 and then look at me and like try to get me to laugh. Anyway, he's a big deadhead. He's got like a Grateful Dead tattoo on his ankle. He's in the econ department. I'm not going to name him, but okay. Anyway, so excess supply, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, right? So pretty straightforward. Does anybody know? There's another term for this. Does anybody know it? Starts with an S.
Oh, surplus.
Surplus. Great. Yeah, it's also known as a surplus. And so if there's a surplus, then we would assume that the price is too high. And think law of demand versus law of supply. Law of supply says as prices go up, more stuff gets put on the shelves. Law of demand says as prices go up, less people are buying stuff off the shelves, right? And so if we have an excess supply, if there's a surplus of goods, then we would generally assume that the price is too high. And so sellers are going to have to lower their prices to sell their inventories. Excess demand. Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Also known as also starts with an S, shortage. Also known as a shortage. What does this tell us about the price? There's a shortage. Price is too low. So sellers are going to raise their price to make higher profits. Okay. I see some people writing, so I'll give you a second.
Military surplus work. They just acquire a bunch of excess goods and then sell them at their price.
Yeah, so
They
they're
work in the market to be sold.
yeah, so there's a market distortion going on with military goods because they're funded by the government. So the government overproduces them.
Okay.
Which is why police departments often have like military gear because they're given the surplus by the government. So that's going to come later with market distortions and stuff. So like the government does not necessarily have an incentive to move toward equilibrium. So the government makes it so that corn gets overproduced. That's actually, you don't need to know this, but on his question, the reason why if you go buy a Coca-Cola in Mexico, it's made with sugar, but if you buy it here, it's made with high fructose corn syrup. It's because the government subsidizes corn farming to protect domestic corn farmers. And so there's a massive surplus of corn in our economy, which gets sold by the government, which gets like pushed out really cheaply because the government is subsidizing it. So the farmers are getting paid more for the corn than the market price. And so there's just a lot of corn in our economy. Also a lot of cheese. The government's sitting on like 1 million pounds of cheese. I know that's silly, right? Yeah. But yeah, just because the government subsidizes dairy. But that's going to come later when we talk about market failure, externalities, public goods, et cetera. That's like chapter 12 or something. So you don't need to know about that yet. Okay, so again, in general, markets tend toward equilibrium over time. So what would you, based on that principle, what would you assume is going to happen if a firm can never sell all of its stock of a good? They're going to have to lower their price. So there's excess supply at P2. They lower the price to P1. And so a few more people are going to try to buy, a few fewer people are going to try to sell, and we get to equilibrium. Somebody from this section, tell me what's going to happen if a firm sells out instantly, can't keep the shelves stocked. What's going to happen to their price? It's going to increase, exactly. And so at P2, we have excess demand. Price is too low. We raise the price, which incentivizes a few more sellers or the same seller to put more of the good up for sale, and maybe scares away a few of the buyers who are only willing to pay below equilibrium. And so we get to equilibrium because now we raise the price. So we had a shortage, now the shortage is gone. And so again, a competitive market, untouched, generally tends toward equilibrium. Later on in the course, we're going to talk about how monopolies might change that, or how, the government, again, for example, there's a huge surplus of cheese and corn in our economy because the government subsidizes it. And so those markets never get to equilibrium because they're being fiddled with. But for now, this is what we care about. Any questions? Any questions about the basics? Because we're about to move into kind of a real world example that probably affects at least about half of you. Any questions? Okay. So have any of you ever noticed that, trying to think of a way to phrase this. Well, have any of you ever noticed that identical products that are marketed toward women are more expensive? Yeah, so that's called the pink tax. People call it the pink tax because if something is pink, it's marketed toward women and it costs more. And so this is kind of an interesting infographic. Over their lifetime, a woman is going to spend approximately $2,000 more on razors than men, even if they were buying the same amount, because they cost more. Bizarre. Yes.
Women's razors are more expensive.
Maybe, I don't know. They might. What about identical ones?
Women's razors tend to have more of the hydrogel stuff on them.
That may be the case with some. That may be the case with some products, but I'm going to show you on the next slide identical products that are just pink and cost more. So quite literally, these are identical. What is that? Target brand? Identical Target brand shaving cream. You pay 42 more cents for it to be pink instead of blue. And the guy's stuff even has aloe in it. The women don't even get aloe. So you're paying 42 extra cents and not even getting the aloe. That's messed up. It even happens, the British even do it. Look, 11 extra pounds for a pink toothbrush. That's crazy. Why? So again, like assuming like we're looking, I mean, in some cases, yes, maybe, you know, certain women's products are going to be produced differently and might cost more to make, but even for identical ones, it costs more for women. So can anybody tell me why they think this might be the case? Yes.
Just the way humans work with gender, producers are going to know that the men are going to buy and the women are going to buy the women's products. It's kind of just going to happen.
Okay, so women are going to buy women. Okay, so in our culture, right? So pink, you know, stuff that's pink is marketed more toward women. Stuff that's blue is marketed more toward men. Now, again, I'm not making any kind of normative claim about this. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that this is right or good or wrong or bad. This is just how it is. That in our culture, pink stuff is marketed toward women, blue stuff's marketed toward men. That's just how, you know, I guess, I don't know, people in the 50s decided it. And I guess that's, you know, changing now, but it's still, there are still remnants of this. But for the women, okay, so we have this idea that, okay, women are buying that, you know, women are going to buy the product on the left, men are going to buy the product on the right. But why is the product for women more pricey? Thinking of, yes.
More than men, so they increase the price. They know women will buy more of it. I don't know.
Okay, that's exactly it. Women have, so again, not a value judgment, positive claim here. In our culture, there is more pressure on women for these kinds of things than there is for men. You all know that. And so women have a higher willingness to pay for certain products. Now, there are some products where men are willing to pay more. But with products like this, women are willing to pay more. And so we would generally say that their demand curve is further to the right. They have higher demand for these products than men do. These companies hire economists to do research and figure out what the optimal price is. They're not just sitting in a room throwing darts at a board, and they're also not deciding, oh, we're going to charge women more because we hate women. They're charging women more because women will pay a higher price. Now, in some cultures, this may be reversed, maybe, you know, I don't know, but in our culture, this is just how it is. And so using the economic way of thinking, we can shine some light on this phenomenon that affects us and that we see people talk about all the time. Any questions? Now, there's actually a supply-related reason that I was not aware of that I learned yesterday when I was making these lecture slides. Apparently, import taxes are higher for imported women's products. So now I don't know if those Target brand shaving gels are imported, but if they are, the import tax on the pink shaving gel would be around 15%, whereas the import tax on the blue shaving gel would be around 10%. So for some reason, this I do not know why, because tariffs are set, you know, for a plethora of reasons that politicians decide. They're not really set, you know, using principles of microeconomics. And so, you know, tariffs are higher on women's products. And so it makes it more costly to put the pink shaving gel on the shelf or the pink, you know, toothbrush on the shelf. And so we would also say that the supply curve is probably further to the left. What does that give us? Well, the equilibrium price for women's products is higher. Demand is a little bit further right. Supply is a little bit further left. An increase in demand pushes price up. A reduction in supply pushes price up. So what we get is a higher price for the women's products, AKA the pink tax. So any questions about that fundamentally, how it applies to what we're talking about here? Can everybody see the connection? Any questions? And so if you were to draw this, we would say, you know, we could easily draw that the demand curve is a little bit further up and right, supply curve is a little bit further up and left, and we get a higher equilibrium price. Yes.
So I think I asked about this on Friday.
Mhm.
Women's products one, it seems as, well, we're basing it off of entirely different things. I was like, this moved this way, this moved this way. And so that's not like keeping all things equal, but that's just because that's a different product.
Right. So well, actually, it's because we're looking at we're doing two different things that we're looking at on their own. So one on its own is an increase in demand, and the other, the higher tax is making it more costly to put it on the shelf, is a reduction in supply. We leftward shift of supply. And so doing both, combining them, which we can do, okay, we get a higher equilibrium price. So ultimately, you'd have to, you know, change something culturally to change these prices, right? Because people's willingnesses to pay are based on, in some ways, cultural ideas, right? Yeah, I mean, cultural idea. Yeah, so I mean, think about trying to think. So yeah, so this one is an example of, right, like cultural ideas of gender, you know, saying women need to buy this stuff more, obviously pushes the price up. I mean, other cultural ideas. Yeah, I mean, I've heard from my girlfriend that like shopping as a woman for clothes is a lot more complex. That's because, you know, there's going to be like the supply and demand is totally different in that market, right? But I don't want to speculate about things I don't know too much about. But yeah, I mean, you could think of like cultural ideas affecting people's willingnesses to pay in a plethora of situations. So I would imagine, so like peanut butter, for example, is really big in the United States, but it doesn't even really exist in England. And so the supply and demand for peanut butter in England is going to be very different than it is in the United States, because peanut butter is this very American thing, right? There are other cultural differences between countries and states and what, I mean, the demand for sweet tea in Georgia is probably higher than the demand for sweet tea in, I don't know, Maine.
That's weird because I was thinking the exact same state.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't want to say Massachusetts because then you'd all think of like Boston Tea Party and then you associate that, and I don't want to. But like you can imagine, like I have a friend who's from Georgia. He always orders sweet tea wherever we go. He calls it sweet tea. I call it iced tea. He calls it sweet tea. He'll order it wherever he goes. I order unsweetened. He thinks that's bizarre. And so cultural ideas are going to affect demand in different areas, right? Because it affects people's preferences. So any questions? Okay. I hope I haven't stepped on any toes. I know this is kind of a controversial topic, and I'm just trying to look at it from a completely just positive, not normative. Okay. Okay, so let's take another example. Make sure you got attendance in. I know a couple of you walked in late. Real quick, I just want to bring something up. Any questions about the graphing assignment? It's due Friday. You can hand it in. You can hand it in person if you want to. But any questions about that? It's on eCampus. Yep, everything's there. Okay, real quick, let's talk about this. Remember 4691 for the code today. This is kind of an interesting question that got asked on PackBack. Is it ethical to raise prices as the demand for a product increases? Any thoughts? It depends.
Like it's price gouging during a disaster for like water or food. Then it's like obviously not okay.
Yeah.
But if people want more like monster trucks. I mean, what's so bad about raising the price?
So you're saying raising, price gouging on something that's not like a necessity is okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well,
That's like essential. So you're saying that increasing the price on something that's essential is unethical? Yeah. Yeah. So that's a normative belief, and that's fine. And I don't disagree. But again, on the other side, something to consider. Something this person actually said. I'll highlight it. While it is common knowledge that as demand increases, prices must also increase to prevent shortages. Now, it's not common knowledge. If it were, then politicians would probably respond differently to these kinds of things. But it's true, right? And so there's a normative and a positive side. Normatively, we might think it's unethical. But the positive analysis of this is that anti-price gouging laws may create shortages. So there was this example several years ago of a guy who, during a hurricane, filled his truck full of water bottles. And his plan was to drive. He drove like 2 states. He drove like 8 hours to the disaster zone to sell water bottles at a highly inflated price. Now, on the surface, that may seem unethical, right? Because he's taking advantage of people who really need something. But on the other hand, isn't that better than him staying home and doing nothing? Because at least if he goes there, people have the opportunity to buy the water bottle. Right? Like I'd rather be able to buy a water bottle for $15 than not buy one at all, at least have the ability to do so. Well, it doesn't matter because he got arrested. And so nobody got the water bottles, right? Again, I'm not saying it's good or moral to price gouge. What I'm saying is that we need to just understand the unintended consequences. That if demand surges for something and prices stay the same, we get a shortage. And whether you're rich or poor, in a shortage doesn't matter because you can't get it regardless. So I thought this was an interesting question because it poses an interesting ethical dilemma, but it still ties in the, positive economic analysis. Any questions? Yes.
So, I think they did away with it a couple months back, but there for a while in Charleston, they were having like a needle exchange program.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you couldn't get like diabetes, needles or insulin or anything like that for a reasonable price. And so, I mean, a couple people in my family have diabetes and they're paying like $600 a month for needles and insulin.
Yeah.
And people that do drugs go just come in and get them for free.
Yeah.
So how does that? I feel like that gets back to his ethically question. That's what they think.
Yeah.
Like the price of that is so much more high.
Yeah.
And you kind of need insulin to survive if you can't produce it.
So I'd imagine most of the price is from the insulin, not the needle.
Mhm.
Because I imagine needles themselves are relatively cheap.
So it's like that, and then the like actual tester, like the.
Yeah, I mean, well, so first thing I would say is don't be careful if you look at a charitable organization helping out a group of people. Don't say, well, Like, it's good that that's happening. Like, it's better that somebody's getting help than nobody at all, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, insulin has seen this happen, and this is one of those complex issues where I think that price gouging on insulin is unethical. And so, but this is also not a competitive market, right? It's a heavily distorted market. And so with things like healthcare, we're going to talk about this later in the course as we get to more complex issues. With something like healthcare, epinephrine, insulin, there is societal welfare that you might want to focus on, and you might want to subsidize certain things so that they're more readily available to people, right? So that's why we have like FEMA, right? It's like we'd rather FEMA give out the water bottles than some guy go and drive there and price gouge. But the other problem is the companies selling insulin have an immense amount of market power. And so they have this thing called monopoly power, which is not so, this equilibrium stuff is very easy to talk about when it comes to competitive markets. But when we start to talk about monopoly on insulin, when people need that to survive, we might consider that a market failure. And so that's something that's going to come in several chapters where we're going to talk about the limits of the free market. Like, there are certain things as a society that we've decided cannot be properly rationed by the market, and we might need the government to step in. And so that's something we're going to talk about later on. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if you have any questions, you can come down. I'll let everybody else go. Enjoy your night. See you on Wednesday.